Good afternoon, everyone. It is 1:30. We will proceed to call to order the April 24, 2019. What? Yeah, it's okay. 2019 meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. Let me ask everyone to please rise. Robert, would you lead us in the pledge?
Good afternoon, everyone. Please follow along with me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Here.
Director Craven? Here. Director Borchard?
Here.
All right, agenda review. Any changes?
No changes, Chair, but one announcement. At this point in time, we're not seeing a need to hold the special meeting scheduled for May 10th. So unless your board has other directions for us, we won't be meeting again until May 22nd.
Okay, one less meeting is always welcome. All right, let's move on then to public comments. This is an opportunity for the public to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda. Please feel free to step forward, identify yourself, and address the board. All right, hearing none, we'll move on to board member comments. Robert? Charlotte? Dave? No. All right. And we will, we only have two items, 2-minute items on the consent agenda.
Move the approval.
Second? All in favor? All right, let's move on then to item number 3 on the agenda, a presentation by the Department of Water Resources representatives. Hi, Steve.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board, Kim Loeb, GMA staff, and per your board's request, we extended the invitation for DWR staff to come down and address some of the issues and questions and hopefully provide some clarifications, which they've done, and we've got 4 staff here today. At this time, I'd like to introduce Stephen Springhorn. And the way this works is that'll move forward, that'll move back. If you press and hold that for a while, the cursor will come up.
Okay.
It's a little goosey.
Thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, Chair and board members. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. My name is Stephen Springhorn. I'm one of the program leads for the SIGMA program in the California Department of Water Resources. I'd also like to introduce my colleagues, Keith Wallace, who will also be speaking today, Tim Ross, and Anita Regmi. They're from our Southern Region office in Glendale. And so that is the DWR team that's here today. So first off, I'd just like to say that there's been a lot of, groundwater management historically in this area, and the department appreciates that and appreciates the current work, the hard work, and really this area stepping up and doing groundwater management, building off of that legacy and moving forward into the new chapter of groundwater management, which is SIGMA. So we appreciate that. Today, our goal is to, let me see if I get this right. Yep. Provide just a general SIGMA overview. I know many of you are very familiar with SIGMA, but it will allow for the department to provide a perspective of how we are implementing SIGMA and have been and continue to implement SIGMA. And then also the department's roles under SIGMA. And we have a couple of roles that we'll touch on, a regulatory role and assistance role. So as it relates to SIGMA, if you can boil it down into the highest level, there's 2 fundamental principles. And this goes back all the way to the passages of legislation back in 2014 and how the department has been implementing our responsibilities under this new law, developing regulations and implementing our responsibilities, and that is local control. And that's where we, as the state of Department of Water Resources, feel that groundwater management is best accomplished locally, and we are continuing that, moving forward as we implement SIGMA. Now, there's a lot of different roles and responsibilities under SIGMA, and for the department that I work for, DWR, we have a dual role, which is an assisting role. That's a legacy role that the department has played, providing technical, financial planning assistance, and Keith Wallace will go into details of what we have, what we're working on now and we have planned for the future. We also have this newer role of our regulatory role under SGMA, and that is the technical evaluations of these groundwater sustainability plans. Our sister agency, the State Water Resource Control Board, is the enforcing agency, as you're well aware, and there as a state backstop in the case that local management does not succeed. It's a temporary intervention to get local management back on track and back onto the SGMA pathway. And then finally, the GSAs, as you're well aware, have the lion's shares of a responsibility under this local control paradigm of developing these GSAs and GSPs and implementing them through time. And then throughout the entire SGMA process is stakeholder engagement and communication, which is very important in all aspects of SGMA as we move forward. So then the second fundamental principle of SGMA is sustainability. That's the S in SGMA. That's relatively new for much of California. Certain entities have been working progressive or proactively working on groundwater management for a long time, but a lot of basins haven't had that history of that management and working towards the sustainability. And what's new with SGMA, there's a lot of new terminology that came in with the act that we're all of us collectively are getting used to. Even several years after it's passed, the regulations that the department adopted and developed also has some new terminology. But it really boils down to these undesirable results. These are the key performance metrics in SGMA, as we all know, and these are the ones that are going to be tracked locally or defined locally, tracked locally, and tracked through at the state level as well. So the SGMA steps. As we're all aware, the first major step, which was a very big success for the state as a whole.
I have a quick question. Do you want questions as you go along, or would you prefer that we ask our questions when you finish your presentation?
I think I could entertain questions now. I think it depends on how the board would like to do that.
Sherry,
I have no preference.
could you go back to your last slide then?
Yeah.
So, lowering groundwater levels is listed up there as one of your 6 undesirable results.
Yep.
So if we have a situation where our model predicts steadily lowering groundwater levels, but it doesn't predict any other undesirable result, some people say that's acceptable, and other people say, no, that by itself is an undesirable result if you have steadily lowering groundwater levels. Does your department have an opinion on that?
We do, and I have a slide dedicated to that.
Great.
That
Okay,
covers
so
that question.
I'll hold that till then.
Okay, that's a good.
Saltwater intrusion.
Yes.
Right? If you have 2 aquifers, one sitting on top of the other,
Mm-hmm.
one aquifer has a net outflow of fresh water, the other one has a net inflow of seawater. Can you use the net outflow of fresh water to offset the net inflow of seawater and say net where we don't have a net contribution to saltwater intrusion?
So that one, I would need a little bit more information. You know, I'm not in the position at this point to make a determination on that type of question without having the full plan in front of me and the context of that plan. But we can talk a little bit more about that as it relates to how
Thank you.
the sustainable management criteria is developed. And there's some slides on that as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. The SGMA steps, as I was mentioning, the formation of GSAs was the first major milestone for the local agencies and really for SGMA. And that was, as I mentioned, a big success with a lot of hard work with local agencies stepping up and meeting that first major milestone with 99% of coverage of the required areas. So that was very good and provided a lot of momentum going into the bigger step in SGMA, which is the GSP development. So currently, as we sit today, we have over 260 GSAs in over 143 groundwater basins. Those green areas that you see on that map are all of the groundwater sustainability agencies in the state. If we zoom into this part of the state, again, all of the area that is required to be covered is covered, and so that is good going into this next step of SGMA implementation, which is the GSP development, Groundwater Sustainability Plan development. And that is the main event in SGMA. That is the centerpiece of the law, is these groundwater sustainability plans. We have received over 135 or roughly 135 groundwater sustainability plan initial notifications. This is a requirement for any time a plan is going to be developed to notify the department. So we have a clearinghouse on what is called our SGMA portal, where this information can be seen of all the GSPs that are being developed all over the state. And you can see that in the light green color there. Again, if we zoom into the Fox Canyon area or this part of California, again, these GSP initial notifications have been submitted, and the GSP development is well underway. And then it comes time for the implementation after the submission of that GSP. And I have a slide on more of the actual details or steps of leading up to and submission and what happens right after submission of a GSP. So I'll touch on it at a high level right now, and then we'll go into more details in a subsequent slide. But really, implementing that GSP it's over a 20-year implementation horizon. So the intent of SGMA is that sustainability is achieved over that 20-year implementation horizon. It's not achieved overnight, but there's measurable progress over that 20 years through interim milestones every 5 years. So it is contemplated that it is 20 years to implement that GSP to reach sustainability by 2040, in this case for the basins on the 2020 timeframe. And a lot of that is going to be through adaptive management, because we know that there's an imperfect understanding of groundwater just by the nature of it's out of sight. It's hard to understand it completely. And so we at the department realize that there's a lot of knowledge that's yet to be gained and that is being gained right now through this GSP development process. We do expect complete plans that meet the minimum standards by the submission deadline. However, we are not expecting perfect plans. And it's important that those plans are submitted to us within that statutory deadline, which I'll touch on in a slide, next slide. Because without having the plans into the department by that deadline, it takes the jurisdiction away from the department, and it shifts it to the State Water Resources Control Board jurisdiction on what they do next with, and that could trigger that state board intervention. And so I'll touch on that as well. And then finally, the fourth step is achieve sustainability, as I mentioned, within that 20 years. And then after that sustainability has been reached, maintaining sustainability into the future. So there's been a lot of activity that has occurred at the local level through GSA formation and GSP development. There's also been a lot of activity at the department through setting up the framework in the early years of SGMA, as well as some of our current activities I'd like to mention, because they are foundational to the path the locals take through SGMA. So the early days, there were 2 sets of regulations that our department developed and were adopted through the California Water Commission. There were 2 sets of basin boundary modifications to align those basin boundaries to promote sustainable management going into the Groundwater Sustainability Plan development and implementation. There was a fast track of alternatives. If a basin felt that they had what was functionally equivalent to a groundwater sustainability plan, they could put in an alternative. Those were submitted January in 2017. And that arrives in where we are now in 2019, where we are coming close to the completion of those alternative assessments. We're looking for a spring 2019 timeframe to release that information. It's worth noting that those alternatives are just that, alternatives. They're not to be expected to be similar to a GSP, but they're arriving at the same outcome, whether they're likely to achieve sustainability within 20 years or they've already been sustainable for the past 10 years. So, and then the other thing that we're currently working on that will be coming out in the near term is basin prioritization. There's a final round of basin prioritization that will be wrapping up, and draft results will be out for 57 basins in the state in the spring time frame. So that'll be coming soon. And that once that prioritization is finalized in the summer of 2019, all 515 groundwater basins in the state will have final priorities, which will mean the locals know exactly what their priorities are and what their path is through SGMA, whether it's required in the high and medium basins or if it's voluntary on the low and very low priority basins. And then finally, we're gearing up for the main event, which is the groundwater sustainability plans being submitted to the department. And when they're submitted to the department, that triggers a 2-year review by the department. And we're expecting around 45 GSPs to come in by the January 31st, 2020 deadline, and another more than 100 GSPs coming in 2 years after that. So that is a lot of work that the department is getting ready for to make sure to turn those GSPs around in a timely fashion.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
So is it possible that prioritizations could change and somebody could move out of being a high or medium priority basin, and they've been doing all this work, and then suddenly they don't have to do a groundwater sustainability plan?
So technically, yes, there is. Oh, sorry, was that?
So that's possible.
That is possible.
Is Fox Canyon is not being considered in that situation? I mean, with all the work we're doing, I want to make sure that we don't suddenly.
So the prioritization is based on 8 components that are laid out in the water code, and we have to follow those 8 components, which can boil down into the people and the pumping that occurs in basins and the reliance that those people are on groundwater. So it's really a factor of how many people live in a basin, how much it pumps, and some of these other factors. So it's unlikely that some of these high-use basins will fall out of.
So are you alerting the basins that might fall out so that they at least are aware that they're under consideration for maybe falling out?
And that's what will happen during this draft period. And so the draft will come out, there'll be a comment period, a public meeting, and then we'll compile all that information.
So for some of these smaller basins, this could make a big difference to them in terms of how much energy they're putting in now versus what might happen after that. But it'll be this spring then, huh?
Potentially.
Okay, thank you.
And SGMA applies to all 515 basins. However, and the state encourages sustainable groundwater management in all basins. However, as you mentioned, it is required in just the medium and high priority basins. Yep. So just really quickly before I move on, while we've been doing a lot of these regulatory activities at the department, we have been making a concerted effort and committed to continuing our technical planning and financial assistance. And Keith will go into that more, but we feel that it's absolutely necessary for the department to continue that because there is a lot of data that the department and other state agencies have, and we want to make sure that is available to local agencies as they're developing plans, and the funding and planning assistance that we'll touch on. So more specifically, and I'll go through this quickly because Keith will touch on this, but again, the financial assistance, there's 2 propositions that have funding available. $100 million of Proposition 1 has already been allocated to local agencies and GSAs. Proposition 68 is coming with additional $150 million or more for sustainable groundwater management. Planning assistance, and then technical assistance through statewide data sets and other information that we'll touch on in a few slides. And then all for the purpose of aligning these assistance functions to make them relevant for SGMA and GSP development, so we have as many successful GSPs coming to us by those deadlines as we can. And then that is our role to evaluate those GSPs. Now, the GSP, again, is the centerpiece of SGMA, and really at the highest level, what it is it's broken up into 4 main components. The first is who is in the basin, so that's the first part of the plan contents of the regulation. So who are the stakeholders in the basin, who are the beneficial uses and users in the basin. Then it's what are the physical characteristics of the basin, so the hydrogeology, the geology, the water budget, all of those very fundamental, critical pieces of information about the basin. And a lot of that is being collected right now in this basin and basins across the state. The information of who's in the basin and what that basin is made up of, the water budget, is then all that information is leveraged to define where is sustainability going to be defined. And that is, again, the very important part of SGMA. What's relatively new is defining these quantitative metrics, and that will be used to track performance and implement actions in these basins, and where that will be monitored throughout the basin. And finally, how sustainability will be achieved. That's the projects and actions. So projects and actions that will be needed to be implemented in order to either maintain or reach sustainability over those 20 years. So if the GSP is the centerpiece of SGMA, the sustainable management criteria within the groundwater sustainability plan regulations is the centerpiece of those regulations. It is where the sustainability is defined. It's where that sustainability, those quantitative metrics or key performance metrics, will be tracked locally and also tracked by the state to track performance and how it's going over those 20 years. So these 6 undesirable results or sustainability indicators in their general form before they're significant and unreasonable are those metrics. And so in many basins, all 6 of those apply, and those are the 6 things that have to be understood, how they affect the basin, and then quantitative metrics have to be applied. And this gets into your question about declining groundwater levels. And it really comes down to significant and unreasonable. And that is a new term under SGMA. And significant and unreasonable is what takes one of these categories from just something that you monitor to what triggers an undesirable result. So the definition of what is significant and reasonable, the way it's structured in the law and the regulations is determined locally within this framework, and then will be reviewed by the department for reasonableness. Other things that make up those undesirable results are how you understand if they're occurring in your basin. And a key point is these undesirable results apply to the entire basin, the basin scale. A term that was developed in the regulations was minimum thresholds. So these are, you could think of these are the warning lights scattered throughout your basin of when something is starting to happen, you're going to see it and ideally avoid it or adapt to it. And those are at a specific site, a monitoring well as an example. And then also measurable objectives. So if the minimum thresholds are what you're trying to avoid, exceeding those minimum thresholds, the measurable objectives are what you're achieving, what you're trying, your goal to achieve conditions in the basin. So one thing we'd like to get across is, we are working with a number of GSAs across the state, and there's some emerging ideas or questions that are coming up, and some of those pertain to this basin. And one of those is whether or not certain sustainability indicators like land subsidence or water quality could just be said they're not applicable. And so that is something we want to make sure we're clear on as the Department of Water Resources, because it'll impact how we review the plan when it comes to us, is that the default position is that all 6 sustainability indicators apply to a basin, and that undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives are applicable. So in the case of seawater intrusion in a mountain basin, that's clearly not applicable. But if it can happen, it needs to be monitored, and metrics need to be set according to the regulations. Now, there are some options of streamlining because there are 6 of them, so that is a tall task. So one option of streamlining is using groundwater elevations as a proxy. So if there can be a technical justification made that groundwater elevations, which is a key metric across groundwater, can be used to track performance for water quality or land subsidence, that can be used as a proxy metric, as opposed to defining something specifically for water quality or for land subsidence. And then there's the option that I mentioned, if there is seawater intrusion in a mountain basin, that's just not even feasible or applicable. That's just can be determined to be not applicable. So that's just something that we are hearing that more and more as we're running up to the GSP development and submission timeframe, and we want to make sure we're clear on that point. So when we get the plans, they're complete and they adhere to the minimum standards of the regulations. So this gets right to the question, Director Bennett, and I'll use the example of declining groundwater levels here. So it's a little hard to see, it's small, but on the left there is a fictitious basin with a number of monitoring sites. Each one of those monitoring sites with the red circles, that's where a minimum threshold, as I mentioned, that's where that site-specific sort of compliance point is set. As it relates to the question of the glide path, or that's another emerging topic that's coming up around the state, is the glide path concept. Can you continue to draw down levels past January 1st, 2015, which is a critical date in SGMA. We call it the SGMA benchmark date because that's when the law went into effect. And it says if undesirable results were occurring as of that date, groundwater or whatever sustainability indicators or conditions need to be above that line. But that before that date, conditions don't have to be improved. So that is sort of the benchmark date, that January 1st, 2015. Going into setting these very important sustainable management criteria, as I mentioned, the first two components of the plan, the who and the what, is going to be the technical information of the basin setting and the engagement and communication that has occurred with the beneficial uses and users of your basin and other basins will be the foundation for determining where those minimum thresholds should be set, where undesirable results should be set. So it's going to be unique across the basin because in a certain basin, there could be an urban area that has one set of, that's different than an agricultural area. And so there is a lot of variability. And so that's where, when the regulations were being developed, it wasn't really a one-size-fits-all. It was that local control concept where there had to be variability and flexibility built in because of the dynamics in each basin. So I mentioned the January 1st, 2015 date. Again, that's critically important if the GSAs, working with their stakeholders and beneficial uses and users, determine that undesirable results were occurring as of that date, that helps to answer the question if you can go lower. But if undesirable results were not occurring, then there could be a possibility that water levels could go lower into some lower level, not depletion for the entire 20 to 50 years. But that is a critical piece. Also, again, as I mentioned, the beneficial uses and users of groundwater, how that declining groundwater levels would impact those beneficial uses and users. And each group of each basin has a unique set of beneficial uses and users to consider. Question?
So on the one hand, we say one of the 6 indicators of an undesirable result is steadily declining groundwater, right? Is that correct? So
Correct is significant and unreasonable declining groundwater levels. It's not the decline itself, it's the impact, correct?
That's correct. So there can be declining groundwater levels, but if they're significant and unreasonable, that's what triggers the undesirable result.
And so it's been reported to us, at least this is how I remember it, and I could be wrong in terms of exactly what was said, but that your department has indicated that steadily decline, if the model says this is going down and it's just going to keep going down and we don't have any place where it's going to level off, it's just going to keep going down. Is that unreasonable from your department's perspective?
That it will be determined based on the information that's provided to us by the GSA, working with the beneficial uses and users and the stakeholders in each basin. And so at the moment, because I don't have that body of information, or our team does not have that full context, we can't determine what would be or wouldn't be reasonable at this point. But it is going to be, we'll be looking at these factors, whether related to January 1st, 2015, whether undesirable results are defined as of occurring as of that date or not, whether the beneficial uses and users, if the interests have been considered in setting those sustainable management.
So if I could use the example, so let's say we have seawater intrusion, and it's come to this particular spot by 2015. Mm-hmm. So that's the threshold. So the way that I understand it is, you're not responsible for the undesirable impacts that happened up until 2015. But after that, you can't sit there and just keep letting the seawater continue to go in further than that, because now you're past the 2015 threshold mark.
That's correct. If the entities in the basin feel that any more seawater intrusion, which I think it would be fairly reasonable to say that any more seawater intrusion is a significant
Undesirable effect.
effect, but the locals would be determining that any more would be significant and unreasonable, so that would be the line drawn and needed to be maintained.
So your
over that 20
department
years.
wouldn't say even that line has to be maintained if the locals say, no, it's not going to be an undesirable effect if the saltwater intrusion continues to come in?
So there are some other parameters or bounds on that determination, and it gets to the interrelationship of the other applicable undesirable results. So in the case of declining groundwater levels, in isolation, if that was not significant and reasonable, that's one thing. But if that declining groundwater levels is triggering subsidence or seawater intrusion or water quality issues, that's another thing, because all of these undesirable results we know are interchange or working. There's a lot of relationship between them. So if something happens, if groundwater is declining in one area, it might cause another impact. So all of that has to be considered. So seawater intrusion and water quality and declining groundwater levels need to be thought of as it relates to all 6
Thank you.
undesirable results.
Steve, I have a practical question with respect to, we have lots of data with respect to the level, groundwater levels over time, but virtually no data with respect to the impact that those changes in groundwater level have on the end users, on the pumpers. That's that kind of data we don't have. Under those circumstances, in this initial drafting, how do we go about setting a minimum threshold?
Yeah, great question. And a lot of people are faced with that right now because we are at the early stages of this big effort of sustainable groundwater management. And so the department, as I mentioned, understands that we're not going to have perfect plans, but plans have to be submitted to us using the best available information and the best available science that's written into the regulations at the time. So that collective knowledge right now has to be compiled and submitted, and that is what will be put forth. And then again, through adaptive management, they'll be learning through time, and we expect plans to adapt through time. We don't expect plans to put something down that's just unreasonable and then just expect to amend it the day after it's submitted. So it needs to be durable, but we are expecting through 20 years of better understanding, gaining that more of that information that you're talking about.
I'm not concerned about what we draft 10 years from now. I'm concerned with what we draft now.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that 10 years from now or over time, as we gain the information, the plan should be refined and improved.
Yeah.
But we don't have information. So how do we draft that today?
Again, that goes to whatever information, the best available information you have today.
Even if it's no information.
And in the case of no information, I think it depends on what part of the plan that is. And I could follow up on, a
Well,
specific.
specifically with respect to minimum thresholds, I guess is what I'm concerned about.
And Chair West, if I may, we had this discussion, and to remind Stephen, I think you said you identify that gap, and then you close it over the first 5-year period. I think that gets to the question you're answering.
Okay?
Yeah,
If that's,
it gets to if there are certain things that there needs to be something put down. It just can't be nothing, because that could trigger an incomplete plan. However, we are expecting, and the regs allow for this, if the GSAs are upfront about the gaps that are there and have a plan to fill those gaps through, within that first 5 years, there is that ability to identify the data gaps and fill them through time. Okay. All right. And then just wrapping up on the considerations on the sustainable management criteria. Now, there's a lot of focus on within the basin, and that's very important because a lot of the requirements of SGMA are about the basin and basin-wide sustainability. But as it relates to where undesirable results, where minimum thresholds are set, there also needs to be an awareness of how that would affect adjacent basins. And so if there are declining groundwater levels in this case, that if the basin thinks, well, that's fine for our basin, but that's going to adversely affect an adjacent basin, that's something that the department is going to be looking at. That's in the water code. Our role is to see how one plan affects another plan. And so that is something to consider as you're setting your sustainable management criteria is if there is a plan to have a continued glide path, how is that going to affect adjacent basins, along with these other considerations that are on the slide here. Okay, so now this is another emerging question and series of questions, and it makes perfect sense. As we get closer to plan submission, there's more questions about how that is going to occur. And we are tracking this closely, and we want to make sure that plan submission is as smooth as possible. There's 282 days till the plan submission deadline.
But who's counting,
Who's
right?
counting? I think we're all very interested in that deadline. But I just wanted to highlight some of the key GSP development and submission, either milestones or key pieces of information that I want to convey to all of you to make sure you're considering as you move forward to this last push towards plan completion. So initial notification, we touched on that. That is something that the basins in this area have submitted and are well on their way. And this little asterisk denotes where there's opportunities for public comment and engagement. So those initial notifications are submitted to the department on our SGMA portal. There's an ability for the public or anyone to comment on those initial notifications. So that is an opportunity for engagement. Again, meetings like today, there's opportunities as the GSPs are developed for public communication and engagement. And then GSP adoption. So there is some pre-work that has to be done in order to adopt the plan in time to submit it to the department by January 31st, 2020 for the critically overdrafted basins. And that is a public hearing that has to occur after 90 days after a notice to the cities and counties. And there's a provision in SGMA that explains this further about the sequence of events here, but just something that is very important to contemplate as you run up to the plan completion and submission. Then the GSP submission to DWR by the deadline. Again, 282 days away. When a plan comes to the department, there's going to be at least a 60-day public comment period that we are required to by law to have. So that is another area where there'll be additional feedback to the locals, to the department on people's thoughts and considerations of these plans, adopted plans. The department will be considering all comments received within the plan. There's a requirement to summarize public comment and engagement that happened during the plan development, and then the comments we receive through the public comment process. So we'll be considering those as part of our technical review. Now, as I mentioned, it is important that it's understood, and this was another emerging question that's coming up, is what happens if the local agencies miss that deadline, that January 31st, 2020 deadline. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, the law is very clear that if the department does not receive a single adopted GSP by the deadline, or the department does not receive multiple GSPs, adopted GSPs with a coordination agreement by the deadline, the jurisdiction shifts from the department to the State Water Resources Control Board, and then it's up to them to decide what they're going to do, how they will proceed, if they're going to invoke state board intervention. There's a number of factors that they will be considering, and there's a whole process in Chapter 11 of SGMA, of the Act, that explains that. So once those plans are submitted on time and by the deadline, that triggers the department's review within 2 years. Then it also triggers the GSAs to begin implementing. This is another common question, whether the GSAs are going to wait to see the department's assessment, what the result of that assessment is. But it's clearly laid out in the Act, in the Water Code, that when the GSAs submit their plan, they're required to begin implementing that plan through annual reports requirements and then 5-year updates. And so that is another thing that we want to clarify and make clear, that once GSPs are submitted, the department's going to be doing our role and responsibility, but there is a responsibility at the local level for the GSA to start implementing that GSP. So with that, I know that was a lot of information, but now we'll transition into how the department is working to support and assist the local agencies and related entities with SGMA implementation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen, and thank you very much for the board for allowing us this opportunity to come and speak to you today. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Keith Wallace. I'm one of the program leads, like Stephen, within the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office for the California Department of Water Resources. So Stephen spent a lot of time talking about sort of the regulatory function of the department. I'm going to talk about the assistance function of the department. And so I want to talk about our technical assistance, our financial assistance, and what we call our planning assistance today. So first up is our technical assistance program that we have. We pretty much divide it up into 3 different components. We consider it our guidance and education, our technical support services, and then our statewide data sets and tools. And I'm going to go through each of these details here. So as far as guidance and education goes, really this kind of boils down to our different reference materials that we have. And we do these things on a statewide basis to make sure we make everything available through our website. So we have a number of different dedicated web pages for these resources. We do it so that any GSA or stakeholder within the GSAs can have access to this information. Some of this is sort of like statewide reports that the department has prepared traditionally, or in some cases not quite in some time, as in the case of the Bulletin 118 that we referenced up there. We're in the process of updating that, and that will get released at the end of 2020. We also support the Bulletin 160, the groundwater portion of that report. But then as it's specific to SGMA, one of the things that we've done is put together best management practices, 6 to be specific, and also 4 different guidance documents. And these documents are prepared to help the GSAs and the stakeholders with the development of their GSPs. So each one of these 6 BMPs and the guidance documents provide a little additional guidance to how to follow the regulations and how to develop the GSPs. They're not requirements, so you don't have to follow these things, but it's merely it's information that we provide to help make things a little bit easier to digest, if you will. We have some plans for developing future guidance documents. The first of which is finalizing the Sustainable Management Criteria Best Management Practice document. That this has been draft for some time. The reason for that is we've had quite a bit of emphasis placed on our regulatory role over the last year or so, but also we feel very comfortable with the draft document as it stands right now. We think that the information that's provided in there is pertinent to the GSAs and hasn't really required a finalization. But we do think that there will be some benefit to finalizing the document in the future. We also want to provide some additional water quality guidance documentation, and also some guidance as it relates to depletion of interconnected surface water. And so for those last 2 items, we haven't decided whether or not we're going to put together just guidance materials or BMPs, but we will come up with that in the coming months. So the next component of technical services is what we call our Technical Support Services Program. And so this is a service we provide to the GSAs, and this is where we actually have contractors that we make available to the GSAs to utilize as a resource. And so GSAs can apply for this service, and we call it a service rather than funding because there isn't actually grant money or anything like that that's given to the GSAs. The department employs its own contractors for the purposes of the GSAs to either put in or install monitoring wells. We provide some monitoring training. We'll do downhole camera surveys or subsidence monitoring. We also have some support or some training related to model development and model utilization. We recognize, actually, hopefully you all recognize too, that this area has participated in this program, and we're in the process of developing 2 different technical support services contract with this area, and so those are coming close to completion. And if there's further questions, we have Tim Rossett and Nita Regmi here from our Glendale office that can talk more in detail about that. But that's clearly something that this region has taken advantage of, which is great. So the last technical service component that we want to reference today is our statewide data sets and tools. And so we recognize that there's an economy of scale when the Department of Water Resources will gather data sets or prepare tools on behalf of the state. We can, rather than have all the individual GSAs collect data sets and have sort of these pockets of information spread throughout the state, we can gather things on a statewide basis and make them available to the GSAs to utilize. And so on our data and tools webpage, you can download a number of different data sets or groundwater tools, interactive maps. We have climate change data available and tools available associated with climate change, as well as a number of maps and other reports. Just to continue here, we also have some specific models that are available for download. The one is it's the IWFM backbone model, and then we have a specific app that utilizes the IWFM backbone model called the C2VSIM Fine Grid. And we released a beta version of this last year, and we're in the process of releasing a beta 2.0 version. This says March of 2019, but we actually are planning on releasing this within the next couple weeks here. So more like May of 2019. We'll finalize a calibrated version of that model by the end of June. And as I mentioned earlier, we have some climate change guidance materials. And so this includes a resource guide, some other guidance documents, and some data and tools through what we call our Sigma Data Viewer. And that actually our Sigma Data Viewer has a number of different data sets that you can interact with utilizing GIS capabilities. But all that information is all the data is available for download and utilization by the GSAs or our stakeholders. So next I want to talk about our financial assistance, and Stephen alluded to this earlier. We have had 2 rounds so far, what we call our Sustainable Groundwater Planning Grant Program. And this has been funded by Proposition 1. We've made $100 million total available for this. The first round was awarded in February of 2006, and just under $7 million was awarded to counties with stressed groundwater basins. And then last year in April, we awarded our round 2, and that we awarded a little less than $86 million to all 78 applicants that applied for funding, because we had a sufficient funding to cover that those requests. And how that was divvied up was about $16.2 million for projects that were benefiting severely disadvantaged communities, and about $70 million for activities associated with the development of a groundwater sustainability plan. So we actually have Prop 68 funding now to continue that Sustainable Groundwater Planning Grant Program. We're going to have a 3rd round, and actually we're going to be the Prop 68 authorized $50 million for a 3rd round of the Sustainable Groundwater Planning Grant funding. We plan to release the draft proposal solicitation package actually next month. It says spring of 2019, but it's looking like it'll be next month. And then, like round 2, the funds that are going to be made available are for activities that support the development of a GSP, and we'll likely prioritize those GSAs that did not receive the Proposition 1 funding. That does not preclude those that did. It just means that all things being equal, we'd give priority to those that didn't receive it before. Prop 68 also authorized $100 million, or about $100 million, for what we're going to be calling our Sustainable Groundwater Implementation Grant Program. And that will start probably early next year. And what funding will be available for that is to actually develop projects and programs that will help implement the groundwater sustainability plans. So as Stephen referred to earlier, there needs to be projects and actions associated with the groundwater sustainability plan to help implement them. That's what this funding will be available for, is to implement those types of projects and programs. We don't have the draft proposal solicitation package established just yet, but we do expect that priority will be given to the GSAs and critically overdrafted basins. I don't have a slide for this, but one thing I wanted to mention that actually just this week, our sister branch, the Financial Assistance Branch within the Department of Water Resources, released its final PSP for the IRWM, the Integrated Regional Water Management Implementation Grant Program. So I know that the Ventura area has a very active IRWM region. We highly recommend looking into participating in this next round of grants. There is funding available for the implementation of projects and programs. It is focused on obviously IRWM components. There are some components that would be a little bit different than groundwater sustainability planning, but projects and programs from a GSP are absolutely in line with the IRWM philosophy. And so if you haven't considered looking into that, I highly recommend you doing so. So lastly, I want to talk about our planning assistance that we have available. And first, I want to talk about the actual DWR GSA engagement program that we have. And within each of our 4 different region offices spread throughout the state, we have identified points of contact for each one of the high and medium priority basins. In this case, we have Anita Regmi, who's here and I know is dedicated to this area. And then also you have Tim Ross here that is sort of the senior level person that's dedicated to this area. But each one of these points of contact are meant to be available resources to the GSAs and the stakeholders and be the direct conduit between the Sacramento office, which is where Stephen and I are from, and the region offices to be able to connect the dots between the GSAs and the program. So next, in terms of our planning assistance, we have what's called our Facilitation Support Services program. This is where we, again, like the technical support services, we actually have contractors in place to provide facilitation services to GSAs or stakeholders that are working with the GSAs. And this is to identify different beneficial uses and users. So in other words, to be able to identify stakeholders within a basin, or to just have general public outreach to be able to go and identify or how to put together a public outreach plan and how to implement that plan, just general meeting facilitation, or if there's the need for consensus building. We like to use that in terms of instead of conflict mediation or things like that. But we have made about $2.5 million since 2015 available for this service, and it has really shown to be of very good success in getting GSAs working together with their stakeholders. We typically prioritize funding to where the critically overdrafted basins receive priority, but we have funded both critically overdrafted and non-critically overdrafted basins. So last up here, these are the various points of contact that we have throughout the state, like in the Sacramento office. Stephen and our deputy director that we report directly to is Taran Ravizini. There's Stephen, myself, and Craig Altair, who's another program lead. We have our websites identified as resources available, and then we have our senior points of contact for each one of the region offices. Again, Tim Ross being one of them who's here today. So that's all that we had presented for today.
Well, Steve, why don't you come back up a second? And I'll throw this out, and you or any of your colleagues could answer it. I'm curious, we've heard different things with respect to what the department's expectations are with respect to water quality elements of the GSP, and particularly what the department's expectations might be relative to some of the already existing water quality standards that are out there, whether the regional board or salt and nutrient plan management stuff. Could probably use some guidance with respect to what the department's expectations are, so we know what direction to head in.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that is a common question right now throughout the state. And one of the reasons, as Keith mentioned, we're trying to get some additional guidance out there as quickly as we can to help address and just provide some additional information on this. But as you correctly highlighted, there is a wide variety of existing water quality regulatory programs, regulations, data sets, all of that. SGMA does not supersede any of that. So SGMA is another area where water quality is being asked to consider water quality. So what we've been describing it as is try and leverage the existing water quality information that's out there, whether it's the monitoring networks that are in place, the objectives or programs that are already out there that are managing water quality, and see if there's a way to align or dovetail that type of those existing efforts with what's going on in water quality. To the point of how it works and fits into the GSP, as I mentioned, for each sustainability indicator, we are looking for some type of metric to be defined in the first plan, in the initial plan. And so there is those opportunities to determine whether it's a metric is going to be defined or if groundwater levels can be used as a proxy for that. But we are expecting water quality to be considered in this first GSP, and some type of quantitative metric defined as it's laid out in the regulation. And so there are specific requirements in the regulation that talk about this sustainability indicator, in particular, water quality. And so that is where the details are. And then again, we'll be providing additional guidance on that moving forward.
While you can't answer the question without all the specifics, just generally, if we have a basin that has high groundwater levels, it's not being overdraft, but it has increasingly deteriorating water quality, would that be a concern for the department?
So really, as I mentioned, SGMA is not the new water quality regulatory framework for everything. Again, there's going to be the existing water quality frameworks out there. SGMA is really about how groundwater supply or pumping affects water quality. So the way that it's described in our in the regulations and in the law is the degradation, significant and unreasonable degradation of water quality. So it's how groundwater use is degrading water quality. So it's really sort of narrowing down.
So if the water quality is being degraded by some other thing other than pumping, it's not something that groundwater sustainability plans need to.
That would be one thing to look at, and some of the technical justification that could be used. The other part that is germane to SGMA and water quality is any project or action that the GSA would be doing to meet sustainability or as part of their groundwater sustainability plan implementation. If that somehow is affecting or degrading water quality, that is something to be looking at as well.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from the board?
I would like you to see if you could revisit, and again, without knowing the specifics, I'm trying not to put you on the spot, but my colleague mentioned we have two basins out of the coast that we have seawater intrusion, an upper and a lower. And we've been told, this board, that the upper is more susceptible to seawater intrusion, the lower less so. And in some of our modeling runs from our consultant, we've seen that, in fact, we tend to overshoot improving the intrusion problem in the upper. Am I correct on that? Am I backwards?
It doesn't matter for your question.
We overshoot the bottom and we still have intrusion on the top. And he asked you if we're kind of solving the problem in net balance, is that a perhaps acceptable path to sustainability?
Yeah, and so that, again, it depends on the details of the situation, but how that's handled throughout those four components that I mentioned of what makes up a groundwater sustainability plan. The second component, the physical characteristics of the basin. So in those requirements, there's a requirement to define the principal aquifers of the basin. And so depending on how many principal aquifers you have in your basin and how the seawater intrusion is progressing, or the current conditions of seawater intrusion in those basins, that would be the baseline to start with, is to see, like you mentioned, the upper one and the lower one, there's differences in how much intrusion is occurring. But then it comes back to significant and unreasonable. And how the beneficial uses and users, so the pumpers or other entities that might be impacted from that intrusion, if it were to continue in the lower aquifer, how that plays out in that particular basin. So that would be part of the analysis, is if there is a determination made that in the various principal aquifers that one is less, is significant and unreasonable and one is not, there need to be a technical justification for why that intrusion would be not significant and reasonable. But if there is use in that basin, that might be hard to make that case.
Well, that helps greatly, though. Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the areas I think you mentioned that your department is charged with is evaluating GSPs when they come to you. Assuming that you receive a GSP from a GSA, and you receive essentially something that is purports to be the equivalent of a GSP from some party that isn't, or some entity that isn't a GSA, how would the department evaluate that? And the point I'm making is, suppose you get that equivalent document from the judicial branch.
Yep.
What are you guys doing with it?
Yeah, and so that is a special case, and I know that the distinction of this basin is one of the first adjudications are starting under this new paradigm of Sigma adjudications. So that is a little bit different. And I know in doing just looking at some references in other previous board meetings, watching those on demand, I think it was the December 2018 meeting, the board was here and talked about the dynamics of adjudication and how that works with the Sigma time frame. And actually Sigma continues, and the board's authority continues during those negotiations, or as that plays out. Where our role is that it's in the regulations that if we get a GSP given to us by the courts, we're going to review it within our review criteria as it is set in the groundwater sustainability plan regulations. Now, there's a lot of detail there that we could talk about, but in general, at a high level, we would be reviewing those documents through the lens of the GSP regulations. And then the court would be deciding what to do with our findings. So we'd be engaging with the court.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board? Well, don't go far.
Okay.
Any questions from any members of the public for Mr. Springhorn or, let me look at was it Mr. Wallace?
Yeah, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Now's your chance. Don't ask me these questions. They're here. Let's ask them.
I'm John Lindquist with United Water Conservation District, and I wanted to ask either of the DWR representatives whether they've had a chance to review Stanford and the West's guidance for dealing with water quality issues that was released on the 19th, just last week, and whether you felt that was, if you have, whether you felt it was consistent with where you'll land on water quality guidance for Sigma.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, that is a guidance document that just hit the street, and it is something that the department is aware of, and it's something that our guidance document, that guidance on water quality, will be will be making a statement on how we, if it's consistent with our approach or not, how we're interpreting that. So that is something that is still playing out right now. But we are aware of that document, and it is a reference that that is out there on water quality as it relates to Sigma, as you mentioned.
Yes, Terry Foreman. I'm a member of TAG, and I have a couple of questions for DWR, Stephen, maybe. So the first one deals with a chronic lowering of groundwater levels. You said it was kind of hard to, really comment on that because you need the unreasonable or undesirable effects associated with it. But just in context, if you had, chronic lowering of groundwater levels and never did recover, and they just continued to decline, and you have a water budget analysis for the entire basin that basically shows there's an imbalance for the basin. In other words, the discharge components are greater than the recharge, and obviously there's an imbalance throughout the entire, say, 50 years that was analyzed. Would you consider that an unreasonable condition then? Even if there wasn't any specific identified results over that 50-year period, unreasonable, undesirable results?
Do you want me to address that
Yes.
right now?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and so there are a couple slides that we were able to add here. So it goes to this question right here. And so with some of that additional information about the water budget, and if there is a net, what you would call overdraft of water, that does raise additional lines of evidence that shows that that is not something that is sustainable for a longer term. And it gets to the definition of chronic lowering of groundwater levels. So this is the definition of, in Sigma, in the water code, 107.2.1, that it basically says chronic lowering of groundwater levels indicating a significant and unreasonable depletion of supply if continued over the planning and implementation horizon. That's 50 years as defined in the Act. Overdraft during a period of drought is not sufficient to establish chronic lowering of levels if extractions and groundwater recharge are managed as necessary to ensure the reductions, and it goes on, in normal periods. So that does, where if there's evidence that it's continued declines regardless of the water year type, that starts to raise the specter of that's not likely to be sustainable because it's a continued depletion. And what this is saying is in times of drought, that's one thing, there can be declines, but in times of wet or normal, if there continues to be declines, that starts to raise the lines of evidence that might not be reasonable, because in those years, those are the years that in a sustainable condition, you have a balanced budget, or you have actually a surplus. You could be storing water to be able to be prepared for those future years of drought. So with that additional information, I think that does change the reasoning and reasonableness.
I'd like to follow up on that then.
Yeah.
So if you have groundwater levels that for the full 50 years, the model says they're going down and they're going to keep going down, we don't see for the full 50 years, you're saying that would then raise the question that would be an unreasonable depletion of groundwater?
That does raise the question that, yeah, that does seem to be unreasonable, because it's not fitting the...
Because you're not getting to sustainability.
Because you're not, yeah.
You're never getting to a sustainable...
You're not getting to that sustainable supply. And then, as mentioned, if there's an imbalance in the water budget,
yeah,
that's another line of evidence.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, my second question is a little more difficult. So you've indicated that you need to have quantitative metrics for all the sustainability criteria.
Could you speak into the microphone?
Oh, is it not picking up? I'm sorry. So you've indicated that you need to have quantitative metrics for all the sustainability indicators. So for seawater intrusion, for water quality, for water levels, subsidence, et cetera. And you can't just talk about them. There needs to be quantitative metrics for each one. That can be, for each one that can be measured through time. Okay, so, no.
That's not the question.
So I assume the answer to that is yes, but then,
You're gonna have to look at us.
Yeah, you're gonna have to look at us and
talk,
talk into the
we
mic
need
because
to
we're
hear what
losing you.
you're asking too.
oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, and then talk to, yeah, I want to make sure he gets the question because he's got to answer it. Okay, so water quality is the one that I think everyone's struggling the most with because water quality in itself is, you can't put a quantitative metric on water quality. You can put a quantitative metric on TDS or chloride or any other constituent, an MCL, whatever. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more. You said that you could have a surrogate like water levels to relate to water quality, but I'm assuming that you're going to expect to have some kind of relationship, causal relationship that says, okay, if water levels drop, TDS goes up, and if water levels go up, TDS, just as an example. But you're going to expect to see some kind of quantitative connection between that item, that the sustainability indicator, which is some water quality constituent, and water levels. So can you explain kind of what you're looking for in that regard and how the water levels could be used as a water quality indicator so that, because we got to write a plan and we got to be able to analyze something to give to you that you're going to accept. So if you could help us understand that a little bit better, we maybe hit the mark a little closer.
All right, and I'm just going to grab something. I'm not walking out of the door.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, a common question that's coming up more and more, and that's why we are trying to get something out as soon as possible. And what I grabbed is, as Keith mentioned, this is the draft Sustainable Management Criteria, BMP. And I brought a couple copies, enough for the board members, and then we can get more if needed. But this does have a part on just what your question. It was on how to use proxy for any of the sustainability indicators, as well as things to consider for water quality. But to your direct question is, yes, we're going to need, if they're a true quantitative metric as it's laid out in the regulation for water quality is not set up, then if groundwater levels as a proxy or surrogate are going to be used, there needs to be a technical justification to show that causation or that connection and how it's an appropriate proxy for long-term tracking or performance tracking of water quality. Yep. And so the other thing with water quality is, I don't think I can get there with, actually, let me go to some of our extra slides here. And just backing up to significant and unreasonable degraded water quality, including the migration of contaminant plumes that impair water supplies. And that gets to what I mentioned. It's about the degradation of water quality caused by either groundwater pumping or projects and actions within the plan or the plan's implementing. So that's also in 107.2.1 of the Water Code and as it's defined there. So we have just that relates to seawater intrusion. Here's water quality. So there could be different, because every basin's unique, and even within a basin, there's different parts of a basin, obviously, where there's different urban areas or ag areas, as I mentioned earlier. So the minimum thresholds in the basin for water quality could be different based on the land use type. So in an urban area where there is probably a lot of monitoring for water quality, well, there's already objectives set by the basin plan or by other regulatory frameworks, that could be used. Because in that part of the regulation that talks about water quality on the sustainability indicator and how to set up the undesirable result minimum threshold, it talks about looking into the local, state, and federal standards or standards that are out there for that particular sustainability indicator. And there are a lot of them with water quality. And so of all that, the GSA has the ability to determine what are the constituents of concern for the basin as it relates to sustainable management. And so that narrows it down a bit. And that's where the GSA could focus its efforts on what are those constituents of concern, depending on the variability of the basin. And if then there's another option, if through technical justification, groundwater levels could be used as a proxy. So there's sort of a spectrum of how to address this. But to the root question, we are expecting all the applicable sustainability indicators to be written up in the way that they're described in the GSP regs. And water quality is one of those that are in there. So I don't know if I was too far away from the mic, if you could hear that. Okay.
We could, thank you.
All right. Okay. I can drop these off.
You got a couple more, Steve.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Russell McLaughlin, water rights attorney. In the interest of just hopefully being helpful to the question posed by Chair West, you asked if about a court and review of a court decision and how that relates to SGMA. Under Water Code Section 107.34.4, that section says that Chapter 11 of SGMA does not apply to a judgment approved by a court that qualifies under any of the following two aspects. One, that a local agency or a party directed by the court submits that to DWR for review, and the department, DWR, determines that the judgment satisfies the objectives of this part, which is SGMA. So basically what it is saying is, in the event there is a final judgment, either stipulated or otherwise in a court, the court can direct either an agency, for example, Fox Canyon GMA, or any of the parties to submit that to DWR as an alternative that is reviewed consistent with 107.33.6. The judgment must achieve the same sustainability goals that would occur under SGMA and a groundwater sustainability plan. If that is the case, and that is approved by DWR, and there's a process for DWR to interact with the court and send back recommendations for improvement, et cetera, just like it would with a GSA for a GSP. If that occurs and you get to that okay judgment, if you will, then the enforcement provisions under Chapter 11 of SGMA don't apply.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Brian Bondi, TAG member. Thank you, Stephen, for coming. My question has to do with the concept of basin-wide sustainability and sustainability at the basin scale. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that works with, for example, seawater intrusion, where the impacts are only in part of the basin and we establish MTs where that's happening? Clearly, the impacts aren't basin-wide, but there's this concept of sustainability at the basin scale. I'm having trouble getting those two to work together in my mind. Another example might be with groundwater levels. If you have depressed groundwater levels in an area that a portion of the basin, because of concentrated pumping or what have you, and that's creating significant unreasonable effects, but it's local. How does that jive with this concept of basin-wide sustainability and the MTs that would be set in that area to address that issue? Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So the first way to answer that question is I just want to read the definition of undesirable result. Again, this is 107.21 of the Act. Undesirable result means one or more of the following effects caused by groundwater conditions occurring throughout the basin. Again, so that is, we know groundwater pumping and groundwater in general is distributed differently, and those impacts can occur all over the basin differently. Let me go here. So all of these graphics are in this Sustainable Management Criteria, BMP. So even though that the impact is felt at the coast for seawater intrusion, the fact that the pumping either at the coast or inland is contributing to that occurring. And so that's where groundwater conditions or effects throughout the basin are relating or translating into seawater intrusion at the coast. So where your minimum threshold would be, that isocontour line of of intrusion would be at the coast, but how you would manage the projects and actions might be throughout the basin, where you're managing the projects and actions throughout the basin to control seawater intrusion at the coast.
So the impact doesn't have to be throughout the basin.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And then for groundwater levels, the same applies, that the groundwater pumping or groundwater level declines don't have to technically be throughout the entire basin, but it's that general pumping that's occurring. Is it leading to impacts in a particular area? And the minimum thresholds can be used. Let me get there. I guess I can use this as an example. The other groundwater level one is further up on the slide deck. But minimum thresholds, as I mentioned, they're site specific. So they're tracking they're representing what's happening within a particular area, not the entire basin. So in order to, the way that the Act and the regs are structured is, there's a lot of these minimum thresholds defined at site-specific areas, so those green circles throughout the basin that represent the conditions in the basin. And what the GSA is required to do is set minimum thresholds at each particular site. So again, taking into consideration the beneficial uses and users, the adjacent basins, the interrelationship of other undesirable results, all the stuff we talked about earlier today. But the next step up is then how many minimum threshold exceedances trigger an undesirable result for the basin. So that is the determination that's going to be discussed locally and determined locally and reviewed by the department. But in this case, we have 5 sites that have minimum thresholds defined for them. The GSA could say if 3 of those 5 are exceeded, that constitutes an undesirable result for the basin. So there is that hierarchy of terms and just the linkage between undesirable results for the whole basin and minimum thresholds for a particular area. So think of the minimum thresholds as a warning light and for a particular part of your basin, but if multiple warning lights go off, that constitutes an undesirable result for the basin.
Any other questions? Jürgen?
Jürgen Gramco. So this is an area where I'm confused as well. So it sounds like within the different management areas, we would have different minimum threshold criteria. Is that correct understanding?
That is an option. You can have different minimum thresholds depending on the part of the basin. That's defined by the GSA working with the stakeholders and beneficial use systems.
All right, so this could get really complicated then with multiple thresholds in different management areas. Then the other thing that, do you have guidance on what coordination agreements should look like? We have a situation where we have 3 contiguous basins, and the lines that define the basins are really, I would say, best guesses. They're not specific fault lines or something like that. So what's a coordination agreement going to look like between all of these basins? Because it appears they're going to have different reduction requirements. Some are more overdrafted than others, it would appear.
Yeah, and the coordination agreements are a very important part of SGMA, and they come in 2 forms. One is required, and that's the coordination agreement called out in the water code, and that's if there's more than one plan in a basin, a GSP in a basin, a coordination agreement is required to stitch those plans together. So that's required coordination agreement. The requirements of that are in Article 8 of the GSP regulations. They're clearly laid out of what is required to be in that coordination agreement. Now, the coordination that you're talking about, and it's my understanding that the basins down here are all moving forward with one plan for the entire basin. Is that correct? No?
Well, one plan for each separate basin.
One plan for each separate basin, yes. So that would mean that a coordination, an official coordination agreement, as it's called out in the Act, is not required. Now, coordination between two basins, so the basin on the screen and the adjacent basin that is not pictured, that is optional. So that's something that's written into Article 8. So that's called interbasin agreements. It says, so the department promotes that because we would like the local agencies to be working across basin boundary lines, because in many cases, those are just jurisdictional lines. They don't actually, there's not a separate two distinct basins. So from the state's perspective, we're encouraging interbasin coordination because the locals can share information and coordinate across that jurisdictional line in many cases. And the guidance or requirements of what an interbasin agreement could have in it, again, it's optional because that wasn't in the Act, that was not required in the law, but it's optional, and the information is in Article 8, and that's Section 357.2, interbasin agreements. And so that's how local agencies, if they choose, can frame up an agreement between two adjacent subbasins. Because at the end of the day, when these plans come to the department, we'll be reviewing basin-wide sustainability, but it's our role to also determine if, as I mentioned, one plan adversely affects plans in an adjacent basin. So that's where we would like as much information, as much coordination to have occurred at the local level before the department weighs in and the state weighs in on determining if one plan affecting another. So Article 8 is where that information resides. Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Just return back to the board. Any questions for the board? No? Well, Steve, thank you very much. I appreciate it. You gave us a good deal of information, a good deal to think about, and now we'll just have to figure out where to go with it.
Yeah, all right. And again, I thank you for your time and appreciate the opportunity to be down here and all the hard work that you and everyone in the basins are working towards sustainability. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, I guess we simply move on to item number 4 then, the GSP update.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board, Kim Loeb, GMA staff again. So some of the activities that have occurred since our last update to you, since the February 27th board meeting, DUDEC prepared hydrographs and maps of the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in the basins, along with the historic water levels for stakeholders per your board's direction, and then conducted a workshop on those materials, including sustainable yield and groundwater production on March 15th, excuse me. We had a call with the DWR per your request to reach out to them, and that was very useful, and they agreed to come down and give that presentation they just gave, which I think provided some good clarifications. DUDEC, of course, has been working on the revised draft GSPs during this time, and has developed a revised draft schedule, updated scope of work. We worked with them on that, and contract amendment request. Regarding the schedule has been pushed out a bit with the additional stakeholder workshop that we've been having. This chart's in your board packet, but it would call for the revised draft GSPs to come to your board at the July 24th board meeting. And your board has indicated that you would then open a 60-day public comment period, and that would go then through September. During that time, there'd be an additional stakeholder workshop, probably 2 stakeholder workshops, as there was after preliminary draft, to present the revised draft GSPs and collect stakeholder comments and answer their questions. Then the final GSPs would incorporate any comments that were received, and would be prepared for your board to receive at a special meeting in December, at the scheduled special meeting on December 13th, for your board to consider adoption of the GSPs and subsequent submittal to DWR. As you can see, that leaves not much, a lot of contingency time especially for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley, which are required to be submitted by January 31st, other than the 60-day comment period. So the proposed additional scope of work, and following my brief comments here, Peter Quinlan from DUDEC will talk a little bit about some of the additional scope. Of course, they prepared the hydrographs and maps as an additional scope and had an additional stakeholder workshop, but also are working on additional analysis of simulations of future groundwater conditions, principally in the East Los Postos management area, regarding water quality and loss of storage and supply as they may relate to the reduction of groundwater levels, which has been a big topic of discussion today and also at that meeting. And then the ongoing meetings, both board meetings, TAG meetings, and meetings. We have weekly conference calls with DUDEC, keep the project going, and their project management. And this is the not to exceed budget for that. The total is $156,000. That would get us as an addition. That would complete the scope of work that, as we understand it now, to get to the final GSPs. And so following DUDEC's presentation, we would ask you to receive and file the update, approve the revised schedule for GSP development, provide a direction that you may have based on the comments by DWR and the presentation that DUDEC's going to give on the approach of the evaluation of sustainable management criteria associated with the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And then we'd request that you authorize the executive officer to execute a contract amendment to complete the work or finish the GSPs. And if there's no questions at this point, we'll come back to that. I'll ask Peter to come up and give his presentation.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chairman West and members of the board. Peter Quinlan with DUDEC. I'm basically just going to be going over the additional analysis. I just push this one?
Yeah, they got it. Sound booth, could you bring up the next presentation, please? Or AV booth?
This is forward.
Big one's forward, and little one is backward.
Okay.
I don't see anybody up there.
No, this should be presentation 4B.
There we go. Thank you. So this is in the context of the recent discussions over the last several months of chronic lowering of water levels not being sufficient in and of itself. So what we have proposed was to look at additional analysis to evaluate how much storage is lost over the next 50 years with declining water levels, and look at other impacts in East Las Posas, which is the further conversion of the Fox Canyon aquifer from confined to unconfined conditions, and that potential impact on leakage recharge from the overlying San Pedro Formation, potential impacts on water aquifer production as the aquifer converts to unconfined and becomes not completely saturated, and the potential migration of poor quality water.
Before you leave the slide, I mean, your second bullet point there, based on Fox Canyon groundwater management discussions with DWR, chronic lowering alone not necessarily undesirable. And I think we all hear different things, but I heard if it's 50 years and we don't have any point where we see a sustainable, that would strike them as unreasonable. So I don't know that, I don't know that I accept that that's what DWR is saying.
Well, it's certainly not what we heard today. It's what was reported to us before.
Yeah,
Okay, so
that's why we had that today, so that we could actually hear from them. And so here we are. I mean, the point was, I wouldn't want us to take action based on what we heard. We want to base action based on what they actually tell us to the whole board, to our face. And so it looks like we've taken action based on something we heard rather than that. So I'm concerned about that. So.
If I might, Director Bennett, again, we hear different things, I guess, because there was the clarification, I think, from DWR that we haven't had that discussion about significant and unreasonable. We jumped right to long-term chronic lowering equals that.
Well, I mean, we could play the tape multiple times. A very specific question. If for 50 years the model shows it going down and it doesn't ever show it hitting a sustainable level, the exact answer was that would, for them, be an indication that that's unreasonable because you're not ever hitting a sustainable level. And so, and this gentleman right here just said that's not what, you know, that bullet point up there is not what we heard today. I think he heard the same thing. So I don't know how anybody could, it's hard for me to imagine you could say, if there's never a spot where you see a glide path, if it's just always down, that you could say, well, that's reasonable. So that's from a common sense standpoint. But it's not what we were asking for guidance and we got his opinion and he said that would strike them as an indication of unreasonableness. Anyway, so.
Yeah, we disagree.
Yeah.
And I think we ought to just get it clear because he indicated to us that it wasn't strictly that one factoid. It was also the combination of other factors, other evidential things that lead one to make that assumption. Just that initial assumption that we have long-term lowering without any indication of it causing an unreasonable result did not necessarily make it so.
His definition of an unreasonable result is 50 years without ever seeing a sustainable level hit is an unreasonable result. That's what he just said.
Right, but what's the sustainable level? 50 years of lowering doesn't necessarily mean unsustainability. It means that there needs to be an undesirable result. That's the part we haven't done.
No, he identified an undesirable result was 50 years without ever seeing the dropping stop. So you're right, he's right here.
Because I disagree.
Well, I'd like to ask him again. He's right there.
Yeah. So I think it really depends on, it all comes down to wording, right? And this says DWR chronic lowering alone, not necessarily undesirable. So in complete isolation, there could be a condition where a basin that has groundwater levels that are at 10 feet below ground surface, and this happens in some places in Northern California. There could be some lowering of that groundwater level over time that might not be undesirable. But In more complicated or complex basins, again, I think the word alone is really the key there. When you start to talk about other factors of that decline and the interest of the beneficial uses and users and some of that, what you were saying about the local knowledge and local investigation that needs to be done to identify the significant and reasonableness of that path. The other thing that comes into play is over what time frame. So again, chronic lowering during droughts, as it states in the act, it can be during droughts, but then if it continues to decline in normal or wet years, that's a different story.
So if your response before, if I asked, I'm going to ask the question again.
Yeah.
50 years, steady decline, keeps declining. No place does it start to level out. And we're not talking about inches here, right? Your response earlier in this testimony was, for you guys, 50 years, and it never levels out, that would be an indication of an unreasonable, if it was a chronic decline, that would be an indication of unreasonableness, correct? That's what your response was?
With the information that comes along with that definition of significant and unreasonable, if there are 50 years of continued chronic declines of groundwater levels in drought years, in wet years,
right,
in normal years,
all years,
that is likely undesirable.
Thank you.
And that goes along with that it's determined at the local level that decline would trigger, yeah.
We realize we determine it at the local level, but we wanted to know what your perception of that, and your perception is that would indicate that would likely be unreasonable.
Yeah,
So
and
that's what we're hearing from you.
Yeah, and our perception is guided by the information that we're going to be getting from
the local
that in the adopted GSPs.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, thanks.
That was an interesting discussion between you two, but let's keep it back into perspective here as to what the actual context of this and how it's being laid out and what he's actually reviewing here. And this goes back to the East Las Posas, and water levels right now are significantly higher than historical in that basin. That back in the 1970s, that water level in that basin started increasing with POTW discharges and Simi Valley discharges. The question that was before this board and was asked by some of the constituents and stakeholders within the East Las Posas was, if that water level is discontinued from Simi Valley and water levels in that basin drop, is that in itself an undesirable effect? Or are we not just going back to what is historical? And what are the impacts there? So that's the context of it. I don't believe for a moment that we're going to ever see 50 years of chronic dropping. And if we did, I would agree with you that that's unreasonable. Good. On the other hand, the basic question that this board has been having difficulty with comes back to the fundamental question, water levels decreasing or the impact of those water levels decreasing triggers the undesirable effect. That's what we got to try and identify with that basin, and that's solely where the problem here is with us that we need to wrestle with and understand. And we got a lot of work ahead of us.
I appreciate that input, and that's precisely the kind of point that I was trying to make, maybe not very effectively. The fact that you might have had the influence of wastewater that increased a level, say a 50-year quantity level. Well, then if that is a fact, a 50-year decline doesn't necessarily make it unsustainable or undesirable. It's a fine point. It's maybe you might call it nitpicking, but it's that discussion that what is unreasonable to the local people in that area. That's the important part. Us just declaring that it's a 50-year decline based on our model doesn't necessarily make it unreasonable. We have to look at the other facts in the basin.
And to that point, we're trying to look at some of those other effects from the baseline simulation, which showed a steady 50-year decline. And those are looking at these other...
I'm sorry, Peter, could you speak up? I'm having a hard time here.
Sorry. And to that point, this proposed analysis looks at what are the effects on supply of a continued decline over 50 years, as we showed in the baseline scenario. And that was to look at the storage basin-wide and locally, to look at conversion of the Fox Canyon from confined to unconfined, and I'll talk about that in a second here, and to look at, as it goes unconfined, what the impact is on receiving leakage and recharge from above from the San Pedro, what that does to the yield to wells in the aquifer where it's no longer fully saturated, and to look at what the impact of the migration of the poor quality water coming from arroyal osmosis is. So just confined and unconfined, very simply, the confined aquifer is the one at the bottom that has the clay layer on top of it. The water level, the potentiometric surface in the well is above the top of the aquifer. It's fully saturated. It's, if you will, overpressured. The hydraulic head is above the top of the aquifer. At the top, above that confining bed, we have an unconfined aquifer where the water level occurs below the top of the aquifer. And this is just the definition I just gave you. So the analysis we propose is to use the baseline scenario that the Callegas Municipal Water District model already generated and look at the loss of storage, the change in storage, or the loss of storage between 2015, which is our starting water levels for a simulation of theoretically 2020 to 2069, to see what the change in storage, the loss in storage is in the Fox Canyon, the Upper San Pedro, and the Grimes Canyon aquifers, overall, basin-wide, and then locally, and determine which where there's an increase in unconfined areas within the Fox Canyon aquifer, because that is the principal production aquifer, and identify which areas become unsaturated. I'm talking about locally and generally because the Fox Canyon aquifer is folded through the tectonic processes, and so there are some parts of it which are much higher elevation than other parts. And we would compare those 2070 changes in storage to the historical conditions, historical low conditions, which occurred in 1974, as shown in the historical model and water levels. And then we could also look at and we can propose estimating additional losses in storage from water level declines beyond the simulated declines up to 2070. And we would look at to look at the impact. So if the top of the Fox Canyon becomes unsaturated, if it becomes unconfined, but you still have confined conditions above it in the San Pedro, you develop unsaturated flow between the two aquifers, and that impedes the rate of recharge to some degree. And we would simulate that with an unsaturated flow model developed by the United States Geological Survey. And then we also will use particle tracks generated by Callegas to show the advance of the 1,500 milligram per liter TDS front under the 5 scenarios that we've shown for the future, which included no change in pumping and different rates of changes of pumping to produce horizontal water levels. And so just to illustrate what I was saying, so this is a plan view map of the top of the Fox Canyon aquifer. Red shows high elevations, blue are very low elevations. And this is, again, this is below land surface. And this is the same image without the base map. And if we rotate it rotated too quickly there, but let's go back. I was told that this would migrate to the other picture, but Sorry. So this is, if you can see the deep, this now looks like valleys and ridges. In the center, you see okay. There it is. So this is the bottom, the top of the syncline. So the top of the Fox Canyon is, 1,000 feet lower than it is here in the more inclined anticline area. So as the water levels decline, this part of the aquifer is going to remain confined, and this part will become unconfined. And there'll be differential impacts for the local folks. And here we're just bringing in that pale blue plane is the 2015 simulated water level. So you can see that in the Moore Park anticline, it's already unsaturated at the top of the anticline, but that the water level here is several hundred feet above the top of the Fox Canyon. So this is part of the analysis. We'll be looking at the effects on storage basin-wide, on production basin-wide, and the effects in localized areas where the water level declines and it becomes unconfined. And so that's the analysis we're planning to do, to bring forward what the impacts are of the lowering water levels, to bring forward to you all for your decision as to what's significant and unreasonable in those results.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions from the board?
I have one for DWR. Yeah, thank you.
You thought you were done.
And basically, it was just a piggyback on what Mr. Quinlan just said right there in that presentation. And the question that immediately jumps to my head then is, if you have chronic lowering of water levels within a basin, whether it is planned or unplanned, how can that not be quantified then as a change in storage or a loss of storage? Therefore, now you have two actions that are immediately tied together. Does that create a problem?
Yeah, and that gets back to what we talked about earlier, the interrelationship or the connection between the different sustainability indicators. So you nailed it right on the head, is that groundwater level declines is really a driver for many of the others. So if you have groundwater level declines, you're going to have reduction in storage. You could have the possibility of land subsidence. There could be water quality issues, stream flow depletion, and seawater intrusion. So all of those working together is part of the analysis that will be done to see what declining groundwater levels, how it'll affect the other sustainability indicators. So that is an analysis that is required to be done, or just that understanding when those quantitative metrics are set. Because if one is set too low, or if the glide path triggers those other ones, that could likely be undesirable. So that's part of that analysis.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Any questions from the public? Did you have more, Kim, or are you done?
Sorry, that's right. Forgot to do this.
Brian Bondi again, TAG member. I would just like to request that the board consider directing staff to have DUDEC review this analysis with TAG before they get too far into it. It's highly technical. I think the process would benefit from that discussion. One example, I noticed that they're noting historical lows in 1970, I forget the number. That's true along the Arroyo, but in the northern central portion of the basin, we're at historical lows today. So we need to reconcile some of these details and make sure that we can come through with an analysis that we all support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I failed to mention that there is a TAG meeting scheduled next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, and we are planning to have DUDA come and discuss this approach with TAG.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again, Russell McLaughlin, water attorney. I just want to urge your board as you approach the review of your draft GSPs and into final adoption that there is a difference in timing between obviously your two coastal basins in Las Posas. Las Posas is obviously under adjudication, and there's no doubt that there's substantial conflict. My goal, representing a large group of landowners, both in East and West Las Posas Basin, is to try to resolve that conflict and truncate the litigation as best as possible. In that, we are running into differences on the reliability of the data that informs the model. And I want to say that there's always going to be uncertainty. We understand that with respect to data, but there is opportunities to improve and try to garner a greater consensus on the status of the basin and what we're dealing with that may be a catalyst for finding compromise ultimately to a settlement. In that respect, as you probably are aware, that the judge in this case has ordered the parties to begin mediation on June 6th and 7th, and that's an opportunity to begin this process for a more conciliatory resolution of this conflict. But it's going to take time, and so using those additional 2 years that you have between 2020 and 2022 with respect to the Las Posas Basin may be critical to perfecting that data, that information on which a compromise might be reached. So rushing Las Posas is probably equivalent to perpetuating the conflict. Using that, not putting your head in the sand, but using that time to improve better understandings and working your board together with all parties in that adjudication to try to reach a compromise, which we might then achieve sustainability that way through a consensus and a stipulated judgment, in my mind, is an optimal route to go and try to avoid spending a lot of money on protracted litigation that may follow if we don't. Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve Bachman, and for you all know, but DWR doesn't. I wrote the last Fox Canyon groundwater management plan. I've been involved in TAG, and of course, like lots of us, we're all involved in adjudication now as well. I was a little frustrated at this discussion today about chronic dropping of water levels. And we're talking here primarily about the East Las Posas Basin. Number one, this is basin that's unlike other coastal basins. It is not controlled by wet and dry cycles, climatic cycles. It's controlled by the amount of water that's being discharged by wastewater treatment plants and dewatering projects. So when we look at long-term chronic, we're not going to have a signature of recovery here because everything is controlled by how much water goes into the arroyo. So let's think for a minute about this. We had water levels that were way much lower, 200 feet lower in the past in the basin than we see today. The reason that we have a significantly higher water level is not because of anything that anybody did relative to groundwater management. It's because of all the water that was put in from development upstream. It just follows one for one. So now we have a basin that's full of water that was not part of the natural process. And that water, the source of that water is going to be decreased in the future. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now. Water levels are going to come down as that water is no longer available. Now, if we look at the groundwater basin, is that something to do with the management of the groundwater basin? Is that chronic lowering of groundwater elevations because of what's going on in the basin? I think the answer to that is no. So when we're talking about an undesirable result being chronic lowering of groundwater elevations, which is not caused by what's going on in the basin, completely external to it, I think we're talking about a whole different proposition. And I haven't heard DWR address that. I'm sure they will when they get when they see some of these plans. But we kind of have an odd duck here, and all the things we've been kind of talking about here don't really apply. So we've been talking past each other a little bit. I think we have to really determine, is that an undesirable result that we're losing storage in the basin that was not storage that was natural, period.
Thank you, Steve. All right, Steve, this is your shot. Question is, and we're evaluating chronic lowering of groundwater levels. Are we looking at native yield? Are we looking at foreign water, or every drop of water in the basin?
So that specific question, I can't answer today. I'd like to consult with our team on that. But as it relates to the gentleman's comment about inputs to the basin, that should be reflected in the basin water budget. And there is a requirement to have a historical, current, and future projected water budget. And so that is where it interfaces with the regulations, where there should be some acknowledgement if there is going to be a change in some type of practice, that should be acknowledged in the water budget or the future water budget, that source of water is likely not going to be there. And so that should be considered in the further or discussion of setting those quantitative metrics with that informed position. And so that is something we would be looking at. So if I failed to mention that, that is the connection where in the projected water budget, if there's a significant source of water that it's known not to, that is not going to be there in the future, that is something that needs to be considered in the water budget, which then permeates through the rest of the GSP development, setting quantitative metrics and monitoring moving forward.
Right, and I think that when you take away one of the sources of water, you expect chronic lowering of groundwater elevations. So the question then is it unreasonable, given the circumstances? That's, I think, going to be the oops. I think that's going to be the question, because that's exactly what we're looking at right now, and the minimum thresholds are actually defined not on what historic groundwater elevations were, but what the drop in water levels were as you lose this source of water, which are still going to be higher than, at least the model shows it's going to be higher than what historic groundwater elevations are going to be. I don't envy you having to deal with that, but it's a very real problem for us.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you both. Any other questions, comments? All right, returning then the recommendations to receive and file the staff report and the report from DUDEC to approve the revised schedule for the adoption of the GSPs and to authorize the executive officer to approve an amendment to the DUDEC contract in the amount of $157,000.
So moved.
I just have a comment. I think I announced in either December or January, I will not be at the July 24th meeting. So I'm sorry I'll miss that.
I'll second the motion.
There's a motion and a second. Will you roll call, please?
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Aye.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchert?
Yes.
And we have a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report.
So moved.
And a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, well, now we're going to adjourn to closed session to return as soon as possible. Thank you all.
Yeah.
We have returned from closed session to report that no action was taken during closed session that needs to be reported out. We're adjourned. Thank you.